Okay, and with that, I'd like to introduce our introduce our very famous keynote speaker, Simon Phipps. I've known Simon for many, many years, and actually a little point of trivia that you might not know, is that Simon was actually the very first keynote speaker at the very first EclipseCon in Anaheim, California in 2004. So that's how long Simon has been a friend of the Eclipse community, although at that time was kind of like a little bit of a love-hate thing, because Simon was the chief open source officer at Sun Microsystems at the time. But I've known Simon for many years. We've had many. If you're really bored sometime, you can find Twitter debates between he and I that have gone on for ad nauseum. And in his copious free time, he's a pro bono director at the Open Rates Group based in the UK. He's a member of the board of directors of the Open Document Foundation, which are the lovely community that brings us LibreOffice. But I know him most from having served with him for many years on the board of the Open Source Initiative, where he is currently the president, and has been a tireless champion for open source and free software for at least 20 years. With great warm welcome, Simon, please take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Well, so Mike and I worked at IBM at the same time, because I was part of the original JTC at Hursley Park in 1995, and Mike was the unlucky victim from IBM who had to write Visual Age for Java. And so I first met him at the end of the 90s. He doesn't look old enough, I know, but... So hello! Oh, that's good and loud. So I thought I'd wear a special T-shirt for you today. This is it. This is my... So you should see the back. So this is the Java launch T-shirt that we made for the open source Java team. So Java has been open source for quite some time. Open source has been around for quite some time. I'm here to talk about the 20 years that have passed since open source was coined as a term for free software. And so I want to run you through a few things. Now, before open source, there was free software. It already existed. Here's two gentlemen who were involved in free software right from the beginning. On the left there, you see Bill Joy, and on the right, you see Richard Stallman. They were both people who were deeply embedded in the software industry at the beginning of the 1980s. Bill Joy actually started in the late 70s as a grad student working on Unix at Berkeley University. They decided to take AT&T Unix and build a distribution of it. And that distribution gradually got more and more its own thing. And by the late 80s, it didn't contain any AT&T code, at least as far as they were concerned. AT&T then sued them at the beginning of the 90s because AT&T couldn't believe they could possibly have replaced all the AT&T code. So at the end of the 1980s, BSD Unix was needing to come out under a license that allowed people to collaborate. And so the team at Berkeley came up with the BSD license. The BSD license is easily summarized as, here is my fantastic code, do whatever you like with it, don't bother me. That's kind of the BSD license. Now, at the same time, over on the US East Coast at MIT, Richard Stallman was working on a variety of software projects. He had written an editor called Emacs, which famously James Gosling then picked up and worked on. And actually, James Gosling was the motivation to Richard Stallman to create the GNU license, the GNU GPL. And at the end of the 1980s, Stallman was forming his ideas about software freedom, articulating them through the GNU project, and coming out with the GPL. And so it was in that context that we started the web revolution, which started at the beginning of the 1990s with two separate forces creating software that was intending to be created in community, with the set of people from the West Coast who believed that what was most important was developers being left alone to invent things, and the group that was on the US East Coast that believed that what was most important was developers having access to the code that they depended on. And those two different views were inputs into the world of what became free software. Now, free software is a term that very much is about ethics. It describes a personal ethical system. And so this statement here from the FSF website really sums up what free software is about. Free software is called free software because the user is free. Unfortunately, this usage creates problems for people who have English as a first language, who typically don't speak any other language, so you can't speak any sense into them. They tend to see the word free and they think you're talking about money. And this is a huge problem, because if you're at all familiar with George Lakoff's theories about framing arguments, you realize that if you make people start talking about money, it's all they can talk about. Every thought has to be framed in the context of talking about how much it costs, how much monetary value it's creating, how much it's adding to the bottom line, because you started with the word free. Although free software is exactly what we need, it is talking about the freedom to use software for any purpose, to study the software, to improve the code, and to share it with anybody. Nonetheless, we kind of lost track towards the end of the 1990s because people kept on needing correcting. They kept on telling that it wasn't about giving code away free. It was about developers being free. And no, those two words weren't the same word. One of them would be translated libre, and one of them would be translated gratis if you were using Latin originating languages. And so at the end of the 1990s, a group of people got together and they decided that they would create a marketing campaign for free software. And this is a quote by Bruce Perens. Bruce is one of the founders of the Open Source Initiative. It was Bruce that was present at the meeting that decided to start this campaign. And he wrote recently that open source is the proper name of a campaign to promote the pre-existing concept of free software to business, and to make it easy for people to do that by certifying licenses against a set of rules. And he points out that it was Christine Peterson, actually, she's a management consultant. It was Christine that suggested this campaign be called open source. And so it was at the end of the 1990s that we were finally able to have a way of talking about both commerce and liberty in the same construct. You see, this is the dock cranes of New Jersey in the posture of liberty. You may get confused. You may think that they are all about liberty. They're all about money. The statue is the one that's all about liberty. But open source allowed us to bring the concepts of free software to the business world, where discussion about freedom is rarely one of the priorities. And it allowed us to create a world where software that was liberty creating could also be used because it was cost effective. And so open source was the campaign that let software users and software developers advance their personal ethical values of software freedom at work as well as in private. And as they say, the rest is history. It turns out that if you make it easy for people to propagate those values, they do. And so the first decade of open source was kind of fun. It's characterized by upstart advocacy, by open source licensing, everyone wanted their own, and by open source business models. It's always good to make sure there's a good cover shot. So let's look at those things. OSI was started in 1998. It was started pretty much by the people who had coined the term open source in connection with free software. And OSI is a global organization. It's a California non-profit corporation, but the board is an international board. Today, that board is elected by its members. You can be a member. I'll tell you how at the end of the talk. And we do a number of things. Most importantly, we define which licenses count as open source licenses. But we also engage in activism. I was involved just today in an amicus brief to the Federal Circuit Court in the US, imploring them to reconsider their judgment that APIs were copyrightable and that Android was not fair use. So that's one of the things that we have just done. Last week, we were involved in a letter to the European Union asking them to reconsider Article 13 of the new copyright directive, because it's going to be a real, what's the polite word? It's going to be a bit of a nuisance to open source communities. So we do those things as well, and we get involved in other areas, such as in standards essential patents discussions with standards bodies. We helping to make people use the term open source about things that are free rather than about things that are free, and so on. That first decade had all sorts of things going on. The open source definition came out in 1999, and at the beginning of that decade, most open source software was a proprietary replacement. People dreamed of replacing the Windows desktop with a Linux desktop or with some other open source desktop. Microsoft was absolutely sure that Linux is a cancer. Everybody else was absolutely sure they needed their own open source license, and so they hurriedly produced licenses with their name in them. In fact, the Eclipse Foundation started out with an Eclipse that was using a license that IBM had created, which they fortunately hadn't put their name in, but nonetheless wasn't a very seemly license, and Eclipse had to go ahead and fix that a few years later. There was a lawsuit in the middle of that. SCO decided that IBM was an easy target for a large amount of money and started a lawsuit which is still apparently rumbling on in the background somewhere in the world. We worked on open standards. We came up with OSR, the open standards requirement, that says what open standards can be created as open source. During this decade, I was working at Sun Microsystems, and my predecessors open sourced Unix in the form of Solaris, and I got the opportunity to open source Java as OpenJDK. And we also, NetBeans, of course, was already open source. Eclipse was already open source. And so the world of Java, by the end of this decade, was a very solidly an open source space. I always thought that was a good thing, because what I originally saw in Java when I was working at IBM in the 1990s was something which was maintained in, by, and through a community. And it struck me that in a connected society, the sort of connected society that the internet is creating, collaborative development is likely to have far more power than isolated development. And so I always felt that it was a good thing that Java went open source. So what made open source succeed in that first decade? I suggest it's three things. First of all, it is OSI's ability to take the consensus of the community, crystallize it, and remember it. Secondly, it is the Open Source Licenses Act of providing a multilateral license. And thirdly, it is open source communities' ability to create safe spaces for collaboration. Crystallization of consensus, that's how license approval happens in the world of open source. The license review process is the process that you go through to get your new open source license approved by OSI. If you're thinking at the moment of getting a new license approved by OSI, I've got one really important piece of advice for you. Please don't do it. We don't need any more. We need the evolution of a few licenses. So I was pleased to see the Mozilla Public License version 2 come out. I was pleased to see the Eclipse license be updated for modern times. But really, we don't need you and your cheap lawyer coming up with another really bad license that basically tries to game software freedom. No, thank you. We don't want it. And it won't be me that says that, because OSI is not the king of licenses. As OSI president, I am not the supreme ruler of licenses, the Donald Trump of licensing. Instead, what OSI does is OSI runs a community discussion. And we let the community discussion quiesce, and then we crystallize the consensus, and we then remember that consensus and create a list of the licenses that the community as a whole think are open source free software licenses. That last phrase is really important. The slide isn't there. That last phrase is really important. OSI is not interested in approving licenses that do not promote software freedom. You may well be able to find a license which meets the clauses of all 10 of the clauses of the open source definition, and your clever lawyer may be willing to argue in public that it meets all the terms of the OSD, but OSI's board will not approve a license that is not a free software license and that does not promote software freedom. So that's one of the things that actually Bruce Perrins has just mentioned on the license list. There is another layer above the open source definition, is the board asks, does it make sense? And if your license doesn't make sense, as for example one has recently on the mailing list made no sense at all, we simply won't approve it, even though we can't think of a really good reason why it doesn't meet the OSD. Bilateral. Now, if you've got good lawyers, they'll tell you that a copyright license or a patent license is a bilateral license. It's like a contract. It's a peace treaty between warring factions who will kill each other or at least cause commercial harm in some area. But an open source license is not a bilateral license primarily. Primarily, an open source license is the constitution of a community. It is the set of things that we all need to agree about the software to be able to collaborate with each other. And so what makes a good open source license is that it is the consensus of the permissions and norms that are needed for a community to collaborate and work together. And the license isn't the only element that is necessary for a community to work together. Open source projects create safe spaces. They do these three things. They mitigate control points, they isolate business models, and they make sure that people that you haven't met yet are able to use the code. What I mean by mitigating ownership of control points, and there's an acronym there, but I'll leave you to find it. Control points are what happens when the artificial monopolies that are given to companies over their copyrights or their patents begin to be treated as if they were property. Copyright was never meant to be treated as property. Copyright was a quid pro quo. It was a social contract. It was an agreement that says, we would rather you didn't keep your clever thoughts private, so we're going to let you exclusively monetize them for a limited period so that you are willing to release them into the commons, into the public domain. And it was a temporary agreement, but what's happened over time is it's got a longer and longer and longer temporary agreement, and it's now become a temporary agreement that's so long that most of our employers think that it's their property. And they now begin to fiercely argue that it should never cease to be their property. Like Mickey Mouse, most of our code is never going to leave copyright because, well, our employers and the people who serve them have made sure that copyright terms have been extended on and on and on. Now, that's a problem if you're going to collaborate, because if you upload some code to GitHub, you do know that if you don't put a license on there, no one can legally collaborate with you. Any code that you make available without a copyright license is all rights reserved. And anybody who takes that code and does anything at all with it is prima facie in breach of your copyright. You have to put a license on the code. And so what open source has done is open source has made sure that everybody knows that they have a license to use all the rights that they need to work on the code. And it has mitigated the fact that there are copyright and patent control points throughout the code so that we can safely come together. The number one thing you want as a developer is to know that you haven't got to ask anyone's permission to do the next thing you want to do. That's the number one thing you want. You want to know, I can write this next line of code without having to ask my manager. I can write this next function without having to ask the lawyers. I can submit this patch back upstream without needing to get permission from anybody. Those are the things that you would like to be true. And open source tries very hard to make sure you have permission in advance to do whatever it takes. And then there's business models. Now, in this first decade of open source, business models were like Bitcoin. They were the thing everybody wanted to talk about, and actually that most people didn't have. Open source doesn't have business models. Companies have business models. And your business model is your responsibility. And it's a problem if your business model begins to impact my business if we are trying to collaborate together. It's not okay for you to, within a community, withhold something I need to succeed because your business is dependent on keeping it secret. And so open source projects have licenses and also governance to make sure that we're all protected from each other. We all need to be protected from each other's business models. And that way we are free to pursue our own business models without being impacted by those of others. And that was one of the core thoughts behind establishing the Apache Software Foundation, for example. Apache was designed to create a padded white box where nobody could harm anybody else, at least in regard to the code. And Eclipse is the same. Eclipse is an organization that makes absolutely sure that the business models of other players, particularly powerful players who might be considered to own the language, is as far as possible mitigated. And that's a key attribute of what made open source succeed. It removed the barriers to collaboration, and it meant that by the end of the decade, open source was considered the default. It was considered the way that you did software. You can come back and read these later. The slides are going to be uploaded for you to take a look at. So now we come to the second decade of open source. In the second decade of open source, there was a wave of enterprise adoption of open source software. We began to worry about software patents. That hadn't really been a thing when we got going in the 1990s. But by the mid-decade of the previous decade, they were beginning to be a thing that we began to worry about. And people started worrying about GPL enforcement in particular. And that was because of an undercurrent of conflict between those two communities I illustrated earlier, between the community of the East and of the West Coast of the US. Quick timeline for you. So at the beginning of the decade, most open source was hidden infrastructure, whereas by the end of the decade, open source is at the heart of almost all new software. It's very hard to think of any system being created today which is not built on open source. Now, that's because the systems we build today are unthinkably complex. They have far more moving parts, far more layers, far more interactions than we would ever have considered was a good thing in, say, 1970. And that means that for us to get started, you can't do what I did when I got when I first started working on computing. I wrote a microprocessor monitor so that I was able to key in the programs that I was then going to run on the computer. And the first thing I had to do was write a monitor. And the first thing I had to do every morning was key it into the computer. Now, today, that's unthinkable. It's unthinkable for you to write an operating system, for you to write a compiler. It's unthinkable for you to re-implement the APIs around a virtual machine runtime. It's unthinkable for you to do anything other than work on the thing that you work on. And so you want to stand on the shoulders of giants, and because there are so many parts, you want to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants without having to ask the giants first. And so open source is now at the heart of everything that happens, every startup, every new initiative. Now, one of the challenges we face is that patents break the safe space of open source projects. They create the fear that there is somebody who is going to come along and try and demand that you ask permission before innovating. And consequently, most open source communities try to mitigate the impact of patents in their projects. Developers avoid places where patents may apply. Now, if you've ever worked for a large corporation like IBM, you'll know you are constantly being incented to file patents. When I was at IBM, my goal was to try and file one a month if I possibly could, because the bonus that I got was a very useful additional income. And I call that parallel filing. That's filing as you work. And most corporations of any size are trying to build their patent portfolios. And so most of the patents around the projects you work on are not going to come from a submarine under the surface. They're not going to come from somebody outside your work. They're going to come from the people you work with. And consequently, it's very important that we use modern open source licenses, because those modern open source licenses mean that our co-workers, our collaborators in the community, are giving us the rights to the patents they're filing as they file them. And we are largely safe from the consequences of large patent portfolios evolving. This is so much an imperative that I would suggest to you that any new project that starts with a BSD or MIT license should be considered with patent suspicion. You should want to know exactly why those people decided to use a license that disclaimed patent rights. Why did you do that? Who do you want to sue? There are perfectly good licenses, like the BSD and MIT licenses, that give patent rights, like the Apache license, or like BSD Plus. Go use one of those. This is becoming an issue now because the world of standards is coming back to the world of open source. During the first decade of open source, we had a long discussion about standards and patents, and we came to the conclusion that it was possible to write open source implementations of standards as long as the standards didn't contain any essential patents. Now, the wireless industry and really their suppliers uses a standards evolution process that specifies and standardizes first and makes a market to recover the cost afterwards. And they've become very comfortable with the idea of recovering costs through market patent licensing. The industry that I've grown up in, the industry that is around computers and around software, doesn't work that way. We tend to implement and monetize first, and then standardization is a way that we create uniformity in the market that has been built by that. In other words, we use standards as a competitive weapon to take away the uniqueness of first movers. And because of that, our industry doesn't really have any standards essential patents in its standards. Standards essential patents is actually a DNA marker that shows you that you're dealing with an industry that doesn't work the way our industry does. And this didn't used to be a problem, because to work in the wireless industry, you used to need €1 million worth of test equipment. You used to need a laboratory with a massive Faraday cage. You used to need to have regulatory licenses from the government. But none of that's true anymore. You can now use software-defined radio. You can use a Raspberry Pi. You can use open source tools, and you can become a very effective collaborator in a wireless market. And as a consequence, the wireless industry is coming around to us and saying, well, we want to do open source too. Oh, but we do still want to collect our patent royalties. And this is leading to an inevitable conflict between the two worlds. And one of the things that's happening now is the wireless world is coming around and saying, well, we really want to use open source, but when we say open source, we mean that you have all rights in advance except patents. And one of the things OSI is doing is pushing back against that and saying, no, that's not true. And we're saying to the European Commission, we would rather you didn't listen to any of that craziness. The other thing that happened in the second decade was GPL license enforcement. Now, GPL license enforcement arises because the open source license you've got is only valid if you comply with its conditions. If you don't comply with the conditions of an open source license, the technical term used to describe you is software pirate. And if you don't want to be a software pirate, then you need to comply with the terms of the license. Now, the only license where anybody has bothered to do any enforcement up until now has been the GPL. And consequently, corporate software developers have been trained to very carefully follow the terms of the GPL. However, I don't think this is the only kind of compliance you need to worry about. When I look at other licenses, like the BSD license, they require you to record the copyright statements of earlier authors. And they require you to do that regardless of how far back in history the earlier author is. And, well, there are a lot of people who don't do that. There are a lot of people who think that if they're using BSD or MIT code, It's just fair game. They can simply use it in their project and not worry. And one day there is going to be a copyright licensing patent troll, or copyright licensing troll, who is going to come after BSD licensed code. And it's going to happen sometime this decade, within the next 5 years, I think. And I suggest you get ready. Because it's already happened in Germany. There's already been a copyright troll called Patrick McHardy, who has pursued people for GPL claims and done so in a way that many of us in the world of open source think is despicable. But just because it's despicable doesn't mean it's not profitable. So what have we learned so far in the last 20 years? Well, we've learned that the game has changed. We've learned that all of your old expectations about how software is developed have changed, and that the rules have changed. And we've learned that open source has got real value, which isn't about money. It's about being able to innovate without needing to ask permission. It's about being able to start where others have reached. It's about staying in control of your resources. It's about sharing the maintenance of your innovation so that you can innovate instead of maintain. It's about being able to, even as an individual developer, influence global ecosystems from your desk at home. It is about being able to be protected from other people who are doing the same thing through the licensing of the code and the rules of the community. And all those things come from software freedom. Ooh, that's exciting. Ding. Let's live in hope, shall we? I said, we'll use a PDF. They never go wrong. Now, what's coming up in the next decade of open source? Well, we're discovering that new technologies are only possible with open source. You can only do cloud with open source, honestly. If you had to go and ask or check for licenses, or more unthinkably, be subject to audit from your supplier over the code that you had deployed in your cloud platform, you simply wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be economic. There would not be a cloud revolution without open source. And I say that with some authority because we tried to do a cloud revolution at Sun at the beginning of the previous decade without any open source, and we failed because of exactly these problems. You have to sit there constantly measuring what's being used so you can pay for it. And similarly, IoT wouldn't happen. Ooh, that's good. Something bad happened there. Doo-ba-doo. IoT wouldn't happen. So Gail, would you like to get my slides back while I carry on talking? There we go. Thank you. So IoT wouldn't happen without open source because you wouldn't be able to roll out all those kernels. You wouldn't be able to work in a world where the device is essentially zero cost because there would be per unit royalties. And there would then be per unit royalties for all the apps that got rolled out and for all the systems that monitored and managed them. And so I believe that open source is fundamental to this coming decade. And so I've got some suggestions for how we should behave in the third decade of open source. And given a following wind, I'll show you what they are.
You're not too far?
No, it's further on. Yeah, that's good. Let's see whether the same defect occurs with the image on the slide that we passed through. Yes! Okay. It's just like the old days when you had a demo in the middle of a keynote, isn't it? So here's the third decade. And the things that this decade are going to be characterized by are assimilation and authenticity. The Borg is here for you, and it's called open source. Now, OSI has grown up since those early days. OSI in the early days was only about open source licenses, and the OSI activity was only run by 10 volunteers who were directors. Around about 8 years ago, the OSI board embarked on a new activity. We started becoming democratic, and I quite recommend it. Democracy is quite good, and I think it should spread as an idea. So we started having individual members You can be a member of OSI, and as a member of OSI, you will have a vote that will decide whether I get to be on the board of directors next time. And so that should be a motivation for you to join. You can vote for having Mike back on the board, because I know you're going to stand again, aren't you, Mike? Yeah. He's only done 6 years. He ought to do some more. And then we've also become an affiliate organization. So we've all of these organizations and more. This list is actually a few months old now, and we've had a number of other organizations join. And we're very proud and pleased to have Eclipse as an affiliate of the Open Source Initiative. The affiliates also vote for the directors of the organization. And we designed the governance of OSI so that it would become very difficult for any particular interest group to take control of the organization. Corporations, for-profit corporations, don't get a vote in the governance. They can still be sponsors, but they don't get a vote. And then the votes for the directors are equally split between the affiliates and between the individual members, so that it's extremely difficult to game the system and have a board of directors which is under the control of a particular interest. And that OSI is leading us forward into the third decade of open source. So here's the 5 things that I think are going to happen this decade. I think we're going to see communities gradually change. We're going to see single project companies becoming less and less viable. We're going to see licensing stabilize. We're going to rediscover that software freedom is really important. And we're going to find new activities that need to have freedom-based consensus as the rule to guide them. And alongside each of those 5 things, there are predictions and recommendations for you and for your company. So community styles. The beginning of open source, projects were mostly engaged by enthusiasts and by people in business who were focused on a single function. And that gradually changed. During the second decade of open source became charity-based. We began to see projects moving into charities so that the shared assets and money could be held safely. And we began to see that the people in those charities were professionals whose careers depended on that particular piece of software. As we enter the third decade, we're more and more going to see that open source projects are members of consortia and that the people who are working with them are professional generalists. That's pretty much where Eclipse is now. Eclipse is now a consortium of different projects. It's actually quite unusual for any one of you to work in all of Eclipse's projects. I don't think you'd have any spare time if you did. But nonetheless, I think that many of you work on multiple Eclipse projects. And it's quite likely that you can change employers based on your portfolio of skills just in Eclipse projects. And I think this trend of having consortia that are managing a platform or a stack or a universe of code is going to become more and more the norm. And that means that within your open source activity within your company or within your career, you should be cultivating cultures of contribution. You should be trying to make sure that people understand that open source is not about giving code away. It is about spending the copyright and the patents to buy a stake in collaboration. Open source isn't giving stuff away. Open source is just spending it differently. And open source results in you having a group of people who will co-maintain your code for you. A group of people who will jointly be responsible for the compatibility of your platform. A group of people who will collectively be responsible for a set of APIs that you depend on. When you contribute, you seed value that you can then reap as it grows elsewhere. And so I think it's very important for businesses to cultivate contribution and to cultivate open source contribution. I know that there are some people here who work for companies that are still kind of slow to have a culture of contribution in the company. And I think it's vital that you develop that culture of contribution, because businesses in this decade are going to be fundamentally dependent on open source. And having your company have skills to be able to navigate open source projects and communities, those are vital business skills now. Those are not the work of first decade hobbyists or second decade specialists. They are now the core skills of software developers in any business. Secondly, I think we're going to see single project companies gradually go the way of the command line. Actually, I'm still using a command line, so maybe there'll still be a few around. In the first decade, everything was about open source business models. Every conference you went to was either about them or had a track about them. There were books written about open source business models. And when people said open source business models, what they really meant was they were trying to find a way to monetize the suspension of freedom in a certain part of the project. Because, slide isn't there. Ultimately, there is only one business model. The only business model there is that I give you from my plenty, and you pay me from your plenty. That is the only business model there is. And in the world of open source, the license makes sure that everybody shares in the bounty of the code. So any business model that depends on the scarcity of the code is automatically going to fail. And as we've gone through 3 decades, we've gradually worked out that that's the case. And we're no longer very excited about paying people just for access to their code. We kind of avoid them. During the second decade of open source, companies began to realize that there was a market for somebody to manage the release of open source software, and that you could sell service around the release of open source software and the packaging of it. And so that there were quite a few Linux distributions that did this. There was quite a market for them. There was, you may remember companies like Mandriva, who made a business out of packaging open source software as a Linux distro. These days, most open source projects have a release train. They no longer need a chief of police deciding when it's safe to release the prisoner. And consequently, that business model has gradually subsided. So in the third decade of open source, the dominant business model for those who want to directly monetize open source is going to be about managing complexity. It is about putting together many elements into a system that only the skills within their company knows how to put together. This is the business model that underlies a company like CloudBees, who very successfully put together many elements into a very complex system. The elements they're putting together are open source, but the ability to compete with them with those same elements is very hard because they have got a lot of people who've got a lot of history of knowing how to run it and scale it and keep it running and scaled. And I think this is going to be the dominant business model in the 21st century around open source. The complex assembly of simple parts into things that are complex and beautiful. And if you're going to do that, then you need to make sure you cultivate skills. Because what will differentiate you as a software company will be that you have in-house the skills that make that complexity viable. More and more, it is going to be retaining a band of deeply skilled people that will differentiate you. And you won't get away with trying to keep the code secret or with trying to withhold releases anymore. Third thing that's going to happen is license consolidation. First decade, everyone wanted their own license. About 80 of us got them. I deprecated a couple while I was at Sun. Mike has got rid of at least, well, he's got rid of a few in his life. And anyone who gets rid of open source licenses automatically is entitled to a Hero of Open Source badge. In the second decade, we discovered that there were a lot of people who wanted to police open source licenses, particularly the ones that had reciprocal conditions, otherwise known as copyleft. And now I'm alerting you to the fact that I think that actually attribution is going to be a problem as well, and that compliance is going to be the key fact of licensing in the 21st century. And that means that you need to automate and accumulate all of the information necessary for both attribution compliance and also for copyleft compliance. And to do those things, I think that you need to automate them right within the build system. You need to make sure that it's impossible for your build to pass if it does not meet the compliance conditions for the activity you're dealing with. And I think we're going to see more and more licenses, more and more use of licenses like the AGPL as a way of protecting complex stacks. And the AGPL means you've got to always be ready to prove compliance. At every release, you need to be ready to prove compliance with AGPL. So I'm recommending to you that you automate this, that you make it a gate factor on your CI system, that you make sure it's impossible to put out a release if it doesn't get a green light for compliance. Just like I hope you do for test, I hope that you'll have as one of your conditions, is license compliance working? And you can do this pretty easily. There are systems you can get like Fossology that you can integrate into your CI these days. I think we're going to rediscover software freedom. We've thought about open source for too long as a matter of licensing. In the first decade, we thought of it as an amoral methodology. We thought of it as simply a way you develop software in community. In the second decade, we began to think more in terms of license dynamics. We began to defer to lawyers. We began to defer to an open source program office who told us how to comply. But I think we have more and more challenges that are coming up upon us now, dealing with how you do cloud. I had Dave Neary was telling me all about the Clay that he's working on, about how development is increasingly moving into the cloud. I hear people telling me about containers and the difficulties they place about knowing which software is actually running in your system. Because you've no idea what software is running in that container. How do you know whether you're compliant with the open source licenses on that container that you just started executing? And then things like a blockchain, where software and data is resident in places that you don't control. And things like IoT, where software is running in places that you can't envisage. How do you solve all of the community problems, all of the licensing problems around those things? I suggest that the way that we do it is by returning to first principles. We could do what we did in the second decade and try and do mechanical checks of licenses and try and deal with each environment in terms of its pragmatic attributes. But I think we need to return to software freedom. We need to go back to, well, that slide isn't there either. We need to go back to looking at software freedom, the freedom to use software for any purpose, the freedom to study software, the freedom to improve it, and the freedom to share it with anyone that we wish to. We need to guarantee those things and then build approaches to cloud, build approaches to IoT that make sure those four freedoms are present. If you do that, if you go back to the principle and then build new capabilities from the principle, rather than trying to pragmatically deal with the expression of the problem on its surface, I believe you'll come up with more viable, more robust, longer-term solutions. Software freedom is your friend. Back in the first decade of open source, there was a war between the world of BSD and the world of GPL. I remember hearing people cursing about how the GPL took away your freedom to give the code to whoever you wanted to. And I heard people from the world of the GPL cursing that those BSD people were stopping them from getting the newly invented code that they wanted. I think that's the old days. I don't think that any of those license wars matter anymore. I think what matters is that we return to software freedom as an ethical construct and use that to build our pragmatic business strategies. I'm hoping that there's going to be some new roles for OSI in the new decade. We've been using this crystallization of consensus method. When there's only 10 of you, you're only effective if everyone supports what you do. And during the first decade, that was true. We used to raise merry hell about people calling things open source when they weren't. In the second decade, we were able to punch much above our weight when people were calling things open source licenses that weren't. And it's all because we have been representing a community and crystallizing the consensus of that community. To do that, we need you. We need you to join OSI. We need you to join in with new activities that crystallize consensus. And that's why I suggest to you that in your work life, in your personal decisions, you join charities as well as consortia. I'm thrilled that you're part of OSI's affiliate Eclipse, but I would also like you to be a part of OSI. I'd also like you to be part of the Free Software Foundation. It would be really good if you were sponsoring the Software Freedom Conservancy. Those are all charities, and they fight your corner at the times when it's most important, before you've realized it's a problem. And we really need you. we really need you to join. So this is the third decade for you. In this decade, I believe you need to create cultures of contribution in your company. You need to make sure that open source is a core skill and not simply something that is peripheral to the business. You need to focus on and specialize in complex assembly, because that is what's differentiating. Compliance is no longer about mechanically complying with individual licenses. You need to be accumulating history for your project, and you need to be automating that process and making sure that the build depends on it. You need to be cherishing software freedom, not simply because Richard Stallman told you you ought to, but because your career as it stands today depends on it having been true, and your successor's career will depend on it having been promoted. And so I'd finally like to ask you to cultivate charities as well as consortia. The consortia do profoundly great things, keeping the individual projects working, but the charities do great things, making sure that the legislative environment lets you still exist, and you need both of us. Open source fundamentally depends on software freedom. The future of open source, I think, is the future of the software industry, and the future of the software industry depends on software freedom. We tolerated for a long time a division within the software freedom community, and I don't think we should tolerate it anymore. I think that we should remain united to protect what allows us to stay software engineers in the software industry and software engineers in industries that consume software. The third decade of open source is also going to be a decade when a whole load of us with grey hair and old t-shirts are going to retire or die, or both. And in this decade, it's really important that you ask and get us to share our war stories. Find out why things are as they are. Find out why Mike made the decisions he did that created the Eclipse Foundation. Talk to him about them. Buy him drinks. He likes beer. And get him to tell you all the old war stories. You can do that to me as well. I prefer Armagnac if you're interested. We need to pass on that experience so we don't make the same mistakes again. Intelligence is making new mistakes, and I think we need to focus on doing that as well. And of course, join OSI. It's been an exciting ride for the first 20 years. I think the next 10 are going to be fantastic. I think we're going to see, as software developers, an opportunity to do amazing things, to reach across the world with our work, to create liberty with our work, to go into space with our work. And I think this is an exciting time to be working, and it's all because of software freedom. Please keep that flame burning.
Thank you, Simon. It looks like we don't have wireless microphone.
Oh no.
So maybe we have time for one or two questions. Yeah, one or two questions. There is a wireless microphone. Yes. Okay. So anybody has a question for Simon? So
I'll talk to you about anything. I'll tell you why we picked the GPL for Java. I'll tell you why I got into terrible trouble for speaking at EclipseCon. So I was lucky enough to speak at the first EclipseCon, and I'm not quite sure how it worked out, but I got the job of going down to Anaheim and going and speaking at the conference, and I gave a talk not dissimilar to the one that I just gave. And when I got back to the office, I discovered that all the executive vice presidents all hated me. Because I had shown up and validated this upstart organization whose very name was about extinguishing sun. And it actually set my career back about a year speaking at your conference, Mike.
I was just thinking, what could be the kind of attacks you could be getting from patent trolls when you are not following the rules of the PSD, for instance? Just you couldn't add the name back and that's it, or they could kind of, do more than that?
So this would be copyright trolls rather than patent trolls. If you're into, just to talk about patent trolls for a second, your best defense against patent trolls is a systemic one. It's to join something called the License on Transfer Network. If you're not familiar with License on Transfer Network, come and ask me afterwards, and I will tell you about it, how it can stop your company feeding patent trolls. If you are being pursued by a copyright troll who wants you to deal with attribution, you do have a problem because you've already infringed their copyright by releasing a copy of the software that doesn't attribute the previous authors, and so you lack a copyright license. You'll find that a good lawyer will probably help you to set aside the case because you've almost certainly got an implied copyright license simply by the code being available. But it's a difficult thing to work. It's far easier to remedy a GPL violation. Remedying a GPL violation is a known quantity, and indeed, companies have been doing great work on this recently. So there's been a new initiative being pioneered by Red Hat to get GPLv2 code have associated with it the remedy clauses of GPLv3. Now, when it comes to attribution, there isn't really a tradition of how you remedy an attribution violation, and so you will have to probably make a best efforts activity. And this is where it's difficult if you're dealing with a copyright troll, because they will make it as confusing as possible for you, and they will disagree with your judgment about whether you have remedied the problem. So I suggest you go get legal advice rather than trusting any of the online forums. Someone once said that a license is like a program you run on a court, and you don't know whether it will actually compile cleanly without warnings until you actually litigate, and that is exactly where you are in this area. No one has done this yet. This is why I suggest be scrupulous, keep all that history, maintain a contributors file. If you look at the BSD, what it says is you must preserve the copyright notice above. It says in the first clause of BSD, it says preserve the copyright notice above. So do that. Keep all the copyright notices you can ever find in history, put them all into the file, and preserve them in a secondary file if necessary, and then you won't have a problem. It's quite easy. You just have to do it.
Thanks. One last question, maybe? No? Yeah, Lars?
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's okay.
Two last questions.
Okay, so you talked about attribution, and I think that's quite a big problem. You said it's easy, but it's not that easy if you have a small device and you have to bring all the attribution stuff with it. And actually, it's also a lot of waste because you have to transport the data there somehow. Nobody will, or only very few people will ever look at it.
Yep.
And is there a discussion ongoing on how to work on that, or how to make this easier for companies to use the stuff, because the freedom to use is relative when you have a lot of work to do to get it used.
So that conversation is just getting going. There are a couple of mailing lists where people hang out to discuss legal and licensing issues. The main one is run by the Free Software Foundation Europe. It's a private list that you have to ask to join, and it's very likely that if you have a corporate attorney who supports you, they will probably be on that mailing list. And a conversation has just started on that mailing list about what the best approaches are to maintaining attribution. Generally speaking, the consensus seems to be that if you've paid attention to the issue, if you've tried, then the court is probably going to find that you are not liable for anything. It's ignoring the problem that's the most dangerous thing. Preserving the copyright notices in a device that has no user interface, you're supposed to do it in the manual. So if you produce a manual that's got the copyright clauses in it, and you put a slip of paper with the URL in the box that the device goes in, that would almost certainly satisfy the terms of the license.
So question is, what's the status of fighting API copyright? And are there more trolls out there other than the one that started the
one, the unblinking eye on the tower by the shore of the redwood,
exactly,
whose gaze we hope not to attract, and we put down the one ring so that we don't. Well, So the most recent development is, how long have you got? I mean, we can talk you through the whole situation there. The lawsuit started as a patent lawsuit between Oracle and Google. Because it started as a patent lawsuit, the US court that the appeal has to go to is a specialist court that deals with patent cases. And the fact that the patent case was completely dismissed and it became a copyright case didn't change that. And so when the lawsuit, the original court found that the APIs were not copyrightable, Oracle appealed. The court they went to was not a specialist court and found against Google. There was then a hearing about damages that was predicated on fair use. The court found that the use of Android's use of Java was fair use. Oracle appealed and it went back to that court again that was not a specialist on copyright. They set aside a jury verdict that it had been fair use. And so the next step is going to be to ask that appeals court to rehear their decision, but what's called en banc, so with all the judges from the entire court hearing the case, rather than just a subset of them. And I and about 70 of my closest friends who, it was Stefano Zaccaroli from Debian described it as the highest concentration of Turing Award winners he'd ever seen. We put together an amicus brief last week, which we filed last night, 20 minutes before the deadline, asking the federal circuit to rehear the case. And that will be what will happen next. Now, the lawsuit itself does not set a precedent in US law, because the court that found the decision was not competent to make that decision in US law. So we won't actually know whether APIs are copyrightable until another case gets brought. And who knows when that will be. I think it's quite likely it will happen. I think it's quite likely that the company being sued will be on the east coast of the US, so it won't be the Ninth Circuit again this time. So maybe by the time I retire, we will have a judgment about whether APIs are copyrightable. For the time being, I'd recommend that you not worry unless you're Red Hat.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you again, Simon.